All right, so here's the thing about Formula One. When you're a new team trying to prove yourself on the biggest motorsport stage in the world, you don't get a lot of time to figure things out. Every decision matters, every hire matters, and sometimes the moves that look totally unexpected on the surface are actually the ones that signal a complete change in philosophy, which is exactly what just happened at Cadillac Formula One. And honestly, it's way more significant than most people are giving it credit for. Look, I've covered a lot of F1 stories, but when a team makes a leadership change this dramatic, just a few months into their existence, it usually means something major is about to shift. The American racing outfit just announced that Marcin Budkowski, a guy who's literally worked everywhere that matters in Formula One, is taking over as team principal, replacing Graham Loden, who was hired way back in December 2024. On the surface, it might seem like just another executive shuffle, but if you actually dig into who these guys are and what they represent, you'll realize this is Cadillac basically saying, we're done experimenting, it's time to get serious. And that's actually fascinating stuff. If you're into F1 drama, insider moves, or just want to understand how top-level sports organizations actually operate behind the scenes, you're going to want to stick around because this story gets way more interesting than it initially appears. I'll break down exactly who Budkowski is, why he's such a big deal, what happened to Loden, and most importantly, what all of this actually means for Cadillac's chances of becoming a championship contender. But first, if you actually care about F1 news and don't want to miss stories like this, hit that subscribe button. Seriously, these kinds of moves happen fast, and you'll want to stay in the loop. So let's talk about Marcin Budkowski, because this guy is legitimately not just some corporate suit they grabbed off the shelf. He's 49 years old, which sounds older until you realize he's been immersed in F1 for the better part of 2.5 decades. That's not some brief stint where he dabbled in racing. That's practically a full career dedicated to understanding how you build championship-winning teams in the most technically demanding motorsport on Earth. His path is actually incredibly diverse, which is probably exactly why Cadillac wanted him. He started as an aerodynamicist, which for people who don't speak F1 fluently, means he was literally designing the physical elements that make cars go fast and handle corners. He did this in Prost, which was a legendary F1 team, then moved to Ferrari, which is kind of like graduating from a good college to studying at Oxford. I mean, Ferrari's the pinnacle of motorsport pedigree. After Ferrari, he went to McLaren, another heavyweight program with a history of excellence and technical innovation. But here's where it gets even more interesting. After his time in the field, he didn't just retire into consulting or commentary. He actually moved into a position overseeing the technical side of F1 itself, working directly with the FIA, which is the international governing body. That's basically like going from being a brilliant architect to becoming the chief inspector, making sure all buildings meet code. It's a completely different perspective, and it means he doesn't just understand how teams work internally, he understands how teams interact with the rulebook, the regulations, and the entire ecosystem of F1. Then he joined Renault, well, technically Alpine, which is what Renault calls their F1 team these days. And here's where it gets relevant to understanding what Cadillac is doing. He actually served as co-team principal alongside Davide Brivio during the 2021 season. So he's not just some consultant who hands in reports. He's actually been responsible for running a competitive F1 program. He's made decisions on pit strategy, he's managed team dynamics, he's dealt with driver politics, and he's had to navigate the constant pressure of delivering results on race weekends. That's the kind of hands-on experience that you simply cannot get from any textbook or MBA program. Since leaving Alpine, he's been doing consulting work and participating in media commentary, which means he stayed connected to the sport, understood how teams are evolving, and stayed sharp on the technical and strategic elements that separate winners from also-rans. When Cadillac looked at available talent and realized they needed a serious upgrade to their leadership structure, Kowski checks literally every box. He's got the technical credibility, he's got the organizational leadership experience, he's got the regulatory knowledge, he's got the strategic mind, and crucially, he's not some washed-up has-been trying to resurrect a career. He's a guy who's actively been engaged with the sport and deliberately waiting for the right opportunity to jump back in at a senior level. What's really telling about this hire is what Budkowski himself said when he took the job. He talked about Cadillac having an extraordinary foundation and ambition, which is interesting corporate speak, but then he got specific about what actually matters: maximizing car development within the cost cap constraints, aligning people and tools, improving decision-making processes, and building what he called a winning mindset. That's not the language of someone who came in just to coast and collect a paycheck. That's the language of someone who's genuinely committed to transforming an organization. He even made the point of noting that his focus would be on making sure the right decisions get made quickly and that the car improves every single time they go racing. That's a pretty bold statement, and in Formula One, you're judged by results, so those aren't just words, that's a commitment. The fact that he used the phrase relentless in the face of setbacks is particularly interesting because, let's be honest, a brand new F1 team is definitely going to face setbacks. You don't just parachute a massive new program into the most competitive racing series in the world and immediately start winning races. There's going to be struggle, there's going to be failure, and there's going to be moments where the entire organization questions whether they're on the right path. Budkowski seems aware of this, and he's explicitly committing to pushing through those moments rather than just accepting them. He even made a point of mentioning that he'd start immediately, with the team racing in Zandvoort next weekend, which is the Dutch Grand Prix. So he's not taking a long lead-in period. He's literally jumping into the fire immediately and starting to make decisions right away. Now, what's really fascinating here is what this says about the state of Cadillac's F1 program in these early stages. According to the CEO Dan Torres, this appointment represents another important step in the continued evolution of the team. And there's a subtle but important message in that language. When a CEO says you're continuing to evolve, what he's really saying is that the previous iteration wasn't quite hitting the target, so we're recalibrating. Torres made it clear that from the very beginning, Cadillac's goal was never just to show up and participate in F1. Lots of teams have done that and achieved mediocrity. The actual goal was to build a next-generation team capable of competing at the very front. That's ambitious. That's almost audaciously ambitious for a brand new team in 2026, but that's what they're claiming they want to do. And Budkowski's hire suggests they're actually serious about backing that vision with the kind of leadership experience needed to pull it off. Torres specifically praised Budkowski's exceptional F1 experience, technical expertise, and strategic leadership. And again, this isn't just executive flattery. These are the exact three things a new team needs if it's going to compete at the highest level. You need experience because F1 is a sport where the learning curve is measured in years, not months. You need technical expertise because the cars are incredibly complex, and small details matter more than almost any other sport. And you need strategic leadership, because when you're building something new, you need someone who can see the bigger picture and make decisions that have consequences 3, 6, 12 months down the line. Here's where things get a little bit sensitive, because we're talking about a guy who got hired pretty recently and now being replaced. Graham Loden was brought into Cadillac back in December 2024, so we're talking about less than 8 months into his tenure. In corporate world terms, that's not even enough time to unpack your desk. In sports terms, it's barely enough time to have a full racing season, let alone establish the kind of organizational foundations you need to succeed long term. So what happened? Why did Cadillac decide to make this change so quickly? Well, according to the official statement, and this is important because we're working with what the team has actually said, Cadillac expressed gratitude to Loden for his leadership and the role he played in forming the Cadillac Formula One team from the ground up. They acknowledged that his contributions helped establish a strong foundation in our build-up phase. So on the record, this doesn't sound like Loden failed or did something wrong. It sounds more like Cadillac is saying, hey, you did your job, you got us to the starting line, but now we need a different kind of leader for the next phase. That's actually a pretty common thing in sports organizations and corporate environments, and it's worth understanding because it tells you a lot about how serious professional teams think about leadership. There's this concept in organizational management called the founder phase and the growth phase, and different kinds of leaders excel at different phases. Some people are absolutely brilliant at starting something from nothing, dealing with chaos, making quick decisions without perfect information, and establishing basic systems and culture. Those are valuable skills, and they're exactly what you need when you're building something brand new. But once you've moved past that initial chaos and you need to actually scale and compete, you often need a different kind of leader, someone who's obsessed with optimization, process improvement, and incremental gains. That person might actually be terrible at the founding phase, but they can be absolute gold once the organization has basic stability. Reading between the lines of what Cadillac said about Loden and what they're saying about Butkowski, it seems like that's essentially what happened here. Loden was brought in to establish the basic infrastructure, get people hired, make the decisions needed to actually launch the team, and essentially create the organization from the ground up. He apparently did that successfully. Cadillac specifically thanked him for it, and they wouldn't have said that if he'd completely botched it. But once Cadillac looked at where the team actually was after 8 months, they probably concluded that what they needed next wasn't another phase of building from scratch, but rather a phase of, okay, we've got a team, now let's make it really, really good. And for that phase, Butkowski's specific expertise in optimization, technical leadership, decision-making processes, and building winning culture probably seemed more relevant than what Loden had been focused on. The timing is also interesting because Cadillac is still in the process of finalizing new infrastructure in Indiana. That's basically their home base, where they'll do most of their engineering work, development work, and team operations. If you're still in the middle of building your physical infrastructure, you're still in founding mode. So why bring someone in who specialized in growth and optimization? Well, the answer is probably that Cadillac looked at their budget, their timeline, and their resources and realized they couldn't afford to spend too much longer in build phase. They need to actually start producing results. They need to go from being a team that shows up to being a team that performs. And that requires a different kind of leadership. It's not personal against Loden, it's just a recognition that different challenges require different expertise. What's actually noteworthy is how clean this transition seems to be. Cadillac didn't attack Loudon or try to blame him for anything. They didn't throw him under the bus. They essentially said, thanks for your work. Good luck with whatever you do next. That's the professional way to handle these situations, and it suggests a few things about Cadillac's organizational culture. First, it suggests they're thinking strategically and long-term rather than getting emotional about personnel decisions. Second, it suggests they're confident enough in their vision that they can be gracious about changing course. A desperate or unsure organization might get nasty about it or try to blame the previous guy for problems. Cadillac basically just said, we're moving in a different direction, which is actually quite classy. Now, here's the part that matters for the broader F1 narrative. This change signals that Cadillac is completely serious about this endeavor. They're not going to hang around with leadership that they think might not get them to their goals. They're willing to make tough calls early and often if it means getting the right people in place. That's actually a very positive sign if you're a Cadillac shareholder or someone who wants to see them compete at a high level. Bad organizations are paralyzed by fear of making changes. Good organizations recognize when a pivot is needed and execute those pivots decisively. Whether Butkowski is the right guy is a different question. Results will determine that. But the willingness to make the change quickly suggests that Cadillac's leadership is not going to be passive about pursuing their stated goal of competing at the front of the grid. Okay, so let's talk about the elephant in the room. Cadillac currently sits dead last in the Formula One constructor standings. Not last with potential, not last but improving. Last. They've been in the sport for a few races now, and they don't have a single world championship point yet. In Formula One, you get points for finishing in the top 10. Cadillac hasn't cracked that yet. When you're a billionaire American company with an iconic brand name and massive resources, and you can't get a single point in Formula One, well, that's a reality check. It's a slap in the face. It's the kind of thing that makes your executives sit around the boardroom and ask some very uncomfortable questions about what's going wrong. And honestly, I think a lot of people underestimated how hard it would be for Cadillac to jump into F1. There's this romantic notion of wealthy companies just parachuting into sports and immediately being competitive. But that's not how it actually works. Formula One has roughly 30 years of accumulated technical knowledge, regulatory expertise, manufacturing process, and competitive experience concentrated among 10 teams. When you jump into that as a new outfit, you're not starting on an equal playing field. You're starting with literally every disadvantage possible. Cadillac has to design cars that can compete. They have to hire talent from other teams, which means they have to convince experienced engineers and designers to leave stable situations and take a risk on an unknown organization.
They have to develop manufacturing capabilities. They have to build sponsorship relationships. They have to establish working relationships with their engine supplier. They have to create the infrastructure for managing tires, aerodynamics, electronics, and a million other technical systems. They have to establish pit crew protocols. They have to build driver development. They have to recruit mechanics and engineers and all the support staff that makes an F1 team work. All of that while simultaneously trying to be competitive against teams like McLaren, Ferrari, and Mercedes, which have been perfecting their craft for decades. The fact that they don't have points yet isn't necessarily a disaster. That's not uncommon for new F1 teams. But it definitely signals that they're struggling more than maybe they expected. When Budkowski talks about maximizing car development within the cost cap, what he's really saying is that they need to get smarter about how they're spending their resources. The cost cap in F1 is a ceiling. Every team can spend up to a certain amount, but most successful teams find that just throwing money at a problem doesn't solve it. What actually matters is how efficiently you spend money and how smart you are about allocating resources. If Cadillac is sitting last, it's probably not because they're underfunded. It's more likely because their resource allocation isn't optimized yet. Their technical direction might not be quite right, and their organizational processes aren't as efficient as they need to be. That's exactly what Budkowski has a track record of improving. Think about what he said about aligning our people, tools, and information flow so the right decisions are made quickly. That's essentially a diagnosis of what's currently wrong. It's saying, right now, we're making slow decisions. Our people might not be aligned on priorities, and our information isn't flowing properly. That's a pretty specific indictment of the current state of operations. It's saying we need to fix our internal processes before we can expect to fix our results. And honestly, that's probably accurate. New teams often struggle with exactly that stuff. People hired from different organizations bring different work styles and expectations. Tools and software systems might not be optimized. Information might be siloed rather than shared. Those are things that don't necessarily show up in the final lap time, but they definitely affect performance when you zoom out and look at the bigger picture. The other thing worth considering is that Budkowski is walking into a situation where expectations are potentially quite high. Cadillac is owned by General Motors, one of the biggest automotive companies in the world. They've got massive resources, they've got the brand heritage, they've got the marketing machine. People expect a company like that to just come in and dominate. But F1 doesn't work that way. You don't dominate through brand name and money alone. You dominate through consistent
excellence in technical execution, smart strategic decisions, adaptive organizational culture, and basically outworking and outthinking your competitors. That's the kind of thing that takes time. The best teams in F1 aren't the ones that just threw money at the problem. They're the ones that got smarter about how they spent money and made consistently better decisions than their competitors over the course of years. Budkowski seems to understand that, which is why his hiring probably makes sense even though the current results are disappointing. What's also worth noting is that this is happening at the Dutch Grand Prix in Zandvoort, which is literally next weekend. So Budkowski isn't even getting a honeymoon period. He's taking over and immediately having to manage a race weekend, make decisions under pressure, and try to extract the best possible performance from whatever car Cadillac brings to the track. That's baptism by fire, and it either speaks to his confidence that he can make an immediate impact or Cadillac's desperation to see change right away. Probably it's a bit of both. The organization is clearly saying we need to improve immediately, and Budkowski is saying I can help with that. We'll see if that confidence is justified. Here's the thing that I find most interesting about this whole situation. The fact that Cadillac felt confident enough to make a change like this tells us something important about how the sport is evolving and how seriously new teams can compete. A few years ago, if you started an F1 team and realized after a few months that your leadership structure wasn't working, you might feel stuck with it. You'd think, well, we committed to this, let's just make it work. But Cadillac clearly felt comfortable saying, nope, we need to make a change, and moving decisively. That suggests they have the resources, the confidence, and the clarity of vision to actually iterate and improve in real time. It also signals that F1 is starting to attract serious talent back to the sport, even in leadership roles. Budkowski had other options. He could have stayed in consulting. He could have kept doing media work. He could have retired and lived comfortably on his reputation. The fact that he took this job on a brand new team at his age, with all the uncertainty that comes with it, suggests that there's something compelling about Cadillac's vision.
Maybe he believes they can actually compete. Maybe he's excited about the technical challenges. Maybe he saw the opportunity to build something from scratch in a different way than he did at Alpine. Whatever the reason, it's the kind of hire that shows F1 isn't a dying sport where talent is drying up. Top people are still interested in competing at this level. The hire also suggests something about the competitive landscape. If Cadillac is willing to invest this level of talent and leadership focus into becoming competitive, it means they're not resigned to being backmarkers. They're not saying, we'll be okay with participation. They're saying, we're going to compete. That intensifies competition at the top of the grid, and frankly, that's good for F1 as a sport. More competitive teams mean better racing, more strategic complexity, more storylines, and more drama. It means the old guard can't just coast. They have to keep improving to stay ahead. So what does all of this actually mean? Let's cut through the corporate speak and be direct. Cadillac just made a statement that they're playing for real. They're not content to sit last. They're not content with participation. They're going to use their resources, their talent pool, and their organizational power to compete. Will they succeed? I honestly don't know. Butkowski's record track is impressive, but he's also walking into a situation where the car might fundamentally not be competitive. The factory might not be ready, and there might be structural issues that can't be fixed by leadership alone. But here's what I think is actually significant. The willingness to make this change shows that Cadillac's leadership thinks there's something fixable about the current situation. They don't think the problem is the car design, at least not entirely. They think the problem is how the organization is being run, how decisions are being made, and how resources are being allocated. If that diagnosis is correct, then Butkowski is exactly the guy to fix it. If they're wrong, and the problem is actually the car, then no amount of leadership change is going to matter, and we'll be having this conversation again in 6 months about a different strategic pivot. My take on this, for what it's worth, I think Cadillac is reading the room correctly. A brand new F1 team doesn't need someone focused on system building as much as they need someone focused on operational excellence and rapid improvement. Butkowski's got that in spades. I think this is a smart hire, and I think it signals that Cadillac is serious about competing. Whether they actually compete at a high level remains to be seen, but at least they're taking the steps that suggest they believe it's possible. And sometimes in sports, belief and commitment matter just as much as talent. It'll be really interesting to see how this plays out over the next few months and years. The Dutch Grand Prix is going to be the first test of whether this new leadership makes an immediate difference. And honestly, I'm pretty curious to see what happens. If you found this breakdown helpful, you know the drill. Subscribe for more F1 analysis, and I'll catch you next time with whatever the sport throws at us next.